A sports team can cost you millions overnight or make you billions over time. When you picture owning one, your mind probably jumps to the glamorous side of it all. The private luxury suite. Walking onto the field before the game. Seeing your name associated with a team that millions of fans admire. But here's the strange part. Almost none of these teams make serious money from the sport itself. Some of them lose money year after year right there in their financial statements. Yet somehow, their owners become wealthier every single year, often by staggering amounts. That isn't a contradiction. It's the business model. Imagine buying a company that operates at a loss, yet doubles in value every few years. That's exactly what's been happening across professional sports throughout North America and Europe for decades. Once you understand why, you'll never watch a game the same way again. But it's far more complicated than it sounds. You probably think buying the team is the hardest part. It isn't. In fact, it's not even the most interesting part. The real engine that drives a team's value has surprisingly little to do with what happens on the field. It's powered by massive television contracts, valuable real estate surrounding stadiums, and an artificially limited supply that no economist would ever describe as a truly free market. Before we go any further, leave your guess in the comments. How much do you think it costs today just to earn the right to join one of the world's major professional sports leagues? Most people aren't even close. Let's see if you can come anywhere near the real number. Let's start with what most people think they're buying. Today, purchasing an established franchise in a major league typically costs anywhere from several $100 million to several $1 billion, depending on the sport and the country. But the purchase price tells only half the story. In most major leagues, you can't simply buy your way in. You can't build a stadium, sign a few players, and declare yourself a member of a top league the way you could open a new restaurant on any street corner. The league has to approve you, and the leagues that truly matter almost never expand unless they intentionally decide to add new franchises. When they do, they charge an enormous expansion fee. Why? Because every new team takes a slice of the pie away from the existing owners. If a new franchise wanted to join a major North American basketball league today, industry estimates suggest the expansion fee alone could land somewhere between $7 and $10 billion. That money doesn't build a single seat inside an arena. It isn't spent on players. It doesn't buy a practice facility. Instead, it's distributed among the current team owners as compensation for allowing another seat at the table. In other words, you could pay $10 billion and still not own a single player, a single building, or a single ticket. What you've actually purchased is something much more powerful: the right to exist inside one of the world's most exclusive sports leagues. This is the first concept you have to understand, because it explains almost everything that comes afterward. This isn't a free market. Anyone with enough capital can open another coffee shop across the street from an existing one. But nobody can create a second major league franchise in the same market without the league's approval, and that approval is granted only in extremely rare cases. Economists call this artificial scarcity, but scarcity that's deliberately created and protected by rules behaves less like an open marketplace and more like a private club with a waiting list that never really gets any shorter. Think of diamonds. Diamonds aren't incredibly valuable simply because they're rare underground. They're valuable because the number released onto the market is carefully controlled. Professional sports franchises work exactly the same way. The supply isn't measured in gemstones. It's measured in league memberships. Most major leagues have somewhere between 18 and 32 teams, and that number barely changes. That's the first reason these franchises become so valuable. There simply aren't going to be many more of them. But scarcity alone doesn't explain why franchise values continue climbing decade after decade. To understand that, we have to look at where the real money comes from, and it's probably not what you'd expect. Ask the average fan how a sports team makes money, and they'll likely say ticket sales, jerseys, food and drinks, parking, all reasonable answers, and all of them represent real revenue. But compared to the biggest income streams, they're surprisingly small. A stadium only has so many seats. A season only includes so many home games. You can only sell food to the people who are actually inside the stadium, and there's only a limited number of events you can host each year. Meanwhile, the two largest expenses, player salaries and stadium debt, continue rising year after year, whether the team wins or loses. The gap between what game day generates and what it costs to operate the business can be incredibly thin. Sometimes it's even negative. One of Europe's most famous soccer clubs reported a pre-tax loss of more than £260 million in a recent season. Once the parent company's financial statements included the enormous costs of maintaining the player roster, the total loss became even larger. This is one of the most recognizable and widely supported clubs on the planet. Its stadium was packed, its merchandise sold worldwide, and yet, on paper, it lost an amount of money that would bankrupt many businesses. Even so, its overall valuation continued climbing, eventually surpassing $4 billion. That's the pattern. So if the day-to-day business sometimes loses money, where does the billion-dollar value actually come from? To answer that, we need to talk about the force that quietly transformed the entire sports industry: television, and everything that came after it. Before television, a team's future depended almost entirely on how many people physically walked through the stadium gates. If your city was small, your earning potential was limited. Then television arrived, and the entire business changed. Live sports turned out to be one of the last forms of entertainment that people still insist on watching in real time. Almost everything else, TV shows, movies, even the news, is increasingly consumed whenever people feel like it. Live sports don't work that way. You either watch it live, or the moment is gone forever. Advertisers are willing to pay enormous premiums for that kind of guaranteed real-time attention because it's become incredibly rare. That's why broadcast rights have exploded in value. One major American football league signed national television agreements worth roughly $110 billion over 10 years, spread across traditional broadcasters, sports networks, and streaming platforms. Meanwhile, a major professional basketball league secured a new national media package worth approximately $76 billion over 11 years. Now here's the part that should really make you stop and think. That national television money is distributed almost equally among every team in the league, regardless of how successful they are on the field. A team that finishes at the bottom of the standings receives nearly the same national TV check as the league champion. Winning doesn't dramatically change that number. Simply belonging to the league does. At first glance, you'd expect the richest teams in the biggest cities to dominate forever. They should be able to outspend everyone else, sign every superstar, and turn the league into an endless parade of the same champions year after year. That would seem perfectly logical. It's also exactly what professional sports leagues have spent decades trying to prevent, because a predictable league is a boring league, and a boring league loses viewers. That's why the leagues force their teams to share revenue. In many leagues, every dollar earned from national television contracts goes into one central pool before being divided equally among all the teams. Others require franchises to contribute part of their local revenue from regional TV deals, ticket sales, concessions, and parking into a shared fund that's redistributed across the league. In some cases, this system shifts well over $200 million every year from teams in major markets to franchises in smaller cities. This isn't charity, it's insurance. If the smaller market teams collapse financially or become permanently uncompetitive, the entire league becomes less exciting, television ratings fall, fan interest declines, and eventually even the biggest franchises lose value. The wealthy teams aren't helping the smaller ones out of generosity. They're protecting the value of their own investments. Now let's look at the other half of the equation, costs. Because those are just as carefully controlled. Player salaries are by far the largest expense for any professional sports franchise. Without restrictions, the richest owners could simply buy every available superstar. To prevent that, most major leagues operate under some form of salary cap. In one major American football league, the salary cap for 2026 exceeds $300 million per team, more than $20 million higher than the previous season, and roughly $100 million higher than it was only 4 years earlier. That's how quickly the economics are changing. Teams are even required to spend a minimum amount. They can't simply pocket the money while fielding a bargain basement roster. Other leagues use what's known as a soft salary cap, allowing teams to spend beyond the limit under specific conditions. But doing so comes with increasingly expensive luxury taxes and additional financial penalties. Why does any of this matter if you're thinking like an owner? Because your largest expense isn't unlimited. Neither are your competitors. The salary cap exists to preserve uncertainty. Fans don't pay to watch an outcome that's already guaranteed. No one wants to tune in every week just to watch the same team win by the same margin over and over again. Uncertainty is the real product being sold. Now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial part of the entire business, the stadium itself. A modern stadium can easily cost well over $1 billion. But here's the uncomfortable truth. In many cases, the owner doesn't pay for most of it. Taxpayers do. One recent stadium project carried a price tag of roughly $2.1 billion, with about 60%, or approximately $1.26 billion, coming from public funding. So how does a privately owned sports franchise convince a city to contribute hundreds of millions or even billions of taxpayer dollars? Leverage. There are only so few major league teams, and plenty of cities desperately want one. That gives owners enormous negotiating power. If local officials refuse to fund a new stadium, an owner can credibly threaten to move the franchise somewhere else. Cities fear losing jobs, tourism, civic pride, national attention, and local business. So many eventually give in. For years, independent economists have argued that these public subsidies rarely produce the economic boom that's promised. Money spent on a game ticket or a beer inside the stadium usually would have been spent somewhere else anyway. A restaurant, a movie theater, or another local business. The money isn't magically created, it's simply redirected. For the owner, however, the stadium often becomes something entirely different. A privately controlled cash machine, built largely with public money. Luxury suites, naming rights, concerts, conventions, special events during the off-season. Revenue from many of these sources often flows directly to the owner, outside the league's revenue-sharing system. Take Robert Kraft as an example. Long before he owned an NFL team, he was a paper and packaging entrepreneur from Massachusetts. As a kid, he attended games as a fan. Years later, he even bought season tickets for some of the worst seats in the stadium simply because he wanted to stay close to the team he loved. Then, in 1994, he purchased the franchise for what was then considered a record-breaking $172 million. Including the stadium lease and surrounding property, the total deal came to roughly $227 million. At the time, many people thought he'd made a terrible investment. Today, that same franchise is estimated to be worth around $9 billion. So how does a lifelong fan with no previous experience running a professional sports organization end up owning one of the most valuable teams on earth? The honest answer has surprisingly little to do with business genius. It was timing. He entered the market just as national television contracts were beginning to explode in value, right before salary caps helped stabilize league-wide costs. And at the exact moment when the land surrounding his stadium started becoming some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the region, he didn't outsmart the market. He simply happened to be standing in exactly the right place when the tide came in. And that tide has continued rising for more than 30 years. If you think that's impressive, wait until you see what happens when this entire system suddenly breaks down. But first, if you enjoy deep dives into how money really works behind the scenes, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next analysis. Back in 1994, players in Major League Baseball went on strike over the league's salary structure. In the middle of August, the season simply stopped. For the first time since 1904, the World Series was completely canceled. No games, no ticket sales, no local broadcasting revenue. For months, nearly every major source of income disappeared overnight. But the expenses didn't. Stadium debt still had to be paid. Guaranteed player contracts remained in effect. Long-term financial obligations continued exactly as before. The financial damage reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and attendance took years to recover because many fans lost trust in the sport altogether. The lesson applies far beyond baseball. The biggest costs of owning a sports franchise are locked in years ahead of time, but revenue can vanish almost instantly if league owners and players fail to reach an agreement. When you own a professional sports team, you're never betting solely on your own business decisions. You're betting that billionaires and elite athletes will continue finding ways to divide an ever-growing financial pie year after year. Now let's look at what a typical year might look like for an established mid-sized franchise. On the revenue side, the team might receive roughly $200 million from its share of the league's national television contracts alone. That income is largely guaranteed, regardless of on-field performance. Add local broadcasting rights, ticket sales, concessions, parking sponsorships, and other commercial partnerships, and total annual revenue often falls somewhere between $350 million and $150 million and $450 million. Now look at the expense side. Player salaries alone can approach or even exceed $300 million, making them by far the largest operating cost. Then come coaching staffs, front office personnel, travel expenses, insurance, marketing, and debt payments on a stadium that may have cost well over $1 billion to build. Altogether, annual operating expenses can easily reach $300 million to $400 million. That leaves a surprisingly thin operating margin. Some years, the team earns a modest profit. Some years, it barely breaks even. And in other years, it loses money altogether, depending on injuries, roster decisions, and countless unpredictable factors throughout the season. Now compare that with what happens to the franchise's market value during that very same year. If media rights become more valuable, if the land surrounding the stadium appreciates, if the league announces a new expansion franchise worth $8 or $9 billion, effectively raising the baseline value of every existing team, the franchise itself may increase in value by several $100 million, even during a year when the actual business barely turned a profit. That gap is the entire business model, distilled into a single idea. You're not really getting paid for how well you managed the team last season. You're getting paid because you own a permanently scarce piece of a growing media and real estate empire. Compared to that, the team's annual operating profit is almost an afterthought. Think of it as a cycle. First, you buy the franchise. The league's artificial scarcity ensures that no competitor can simply open another major league team next door and dilute the value of what you own. Every few years, the league renegotiates its media rights. Historically, those deals have moved in one direction far more often than the other, up. Meanwhile, the neighborhood surrounding your stadium continues to develop, just like any other premium piece of commercial real estate. And because professional sports leagues operate much like protected monopolies, they can pass rising costs on to broadcasters, sponsors, advertisers, and fans far more effectively than most ordinary businesses. The result? Over the past several decades, franchise values have increased at annual rates that make many traditional investments look ordinary. On average, they've appreciated somewhere between 10 and 15% per year. That's also why owners almost never sell, even if selling would instantly make them billions of dollars richer on paper. Because selling means paying capital gains taxes and giving up one of the fastest growing asset classes in the world. So what you're really buying isn't just a sports team. You're buying a permanent seat at one of the most exclusive tables in business. A city determined to keep its franchise happy is often willing to make concessions on zoning, infrastructure projects, and even tax policies that benefit the owner's other businesses. A luxury suite inside the stadium becomes one of the most powerful networking rooms imaginable, where deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars are negotiated that have absolutely nothing to do with sports. That's why so many owners are perfectly willing to accept modest annual profits or even occasional operating losses, because everything they gain outside the balance sheet is often worth far more than anything the team's financial statements could ever show. If you enjoyed this analysis, let us know in the comments. Which professional sports team would you most want to own if money weren't an issue? And if you'd like to see more deep dives into the business behind the world's biggest industries, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.